everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Tortoise Newsroom, and to people watching at home, I'm Liz Moseley. I'm an editor and partner here, and I'm going to try and edit this evening's Open News meeting, where we're going to start the conversation on the topic of long COVID. I want to say a particular warm welcome to people at home from the John Schofield Trust, who are a new partner of ours in the Tortoise Community Network, and they work to improve social mobility by trying to support and mentor talented young journalists so that newsrooms like ours can be better reflective of the world in which we live. And I'm looking forward to hearing hopefully from Nabia later on, who I know is come prepared to reflect on some of the things we're going to be talking about and also pitch some story ideas, so that will be exciting. We're going to start with long COVID. Lara is in the chat. As always, please join in. And if you're in the room, put your hand up, shout out. And who's got the mics? Where are the mics? Seb has got the mics. So that everybody can hear you, please get a mic from Seb. So the question, I think, we did a big story, a big piece on long COVID. How long ago was it, Giles, when we did the first long COVID proper thing? At least 6 months, maybe longer. Maybe a year. So it's not new. We know about long COVID. It's not a new thing that we're just discovering, a sort of strange new quirk of the pandemic. But there is almost nothing else that we know about it, apart from the fact it's not new. We sort of haven't really got very far in our understanding of it, who gets it, what it is, how bad it is, or how bad it can be. Does anything help? You know, treatments and therapies and what have you. And so what we're going to try and do this evening is talk a bit about it as an experience and a disease. And we're joined by some people who have had it or who have got it. And also by Gez, who has a YouTube channel all about it and is the man who knows, you know, lots and lots about what's happening. But I might, if I can, perhaps I'm slightly jumping this on you, but Chloe is there. Chloe is the voice of The Playmaker, which is Tortoise's football podcast. And if you can unmute yourself, Chloe, or if we can get you unmuted. Chloe, you've got long COVID now. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm feeling a lot better, to be honest. I felt a lot better since I had my second jab. So I think I've read something where that has had an effect for some people, having the vaccine. Yeah, I'm still just really building my fitness, because I had COVID in between Christmas and New Year was when I tested positive.
Right.
And just wiped out all through January. And then after that, I couldn't even walk, you know, for 5 minutes without needing to then sleep for 2 hours afterwards, and it was really debilitating. But I am feeling a lot better now.
So you first started
really just building myself back up.
You first started feeling poorly at Christmas time, and then you just didn't get better. And you've been poorly, you know, not like the normal you, the whole year since then.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, feeling this sort of really burning pain in my lungs, and excessive fatigue, and I'd had a rash on my face that flared up every time I tried to do something, you know, even just go to the shop or something like that. But yeah, since the second vaccination, I do feel so much better.
Chloe, what have you tried, if it's not too personal to ask, to make yourself feel better? Have you been to see a doctor or somebody else to try and help you feel better in the intervening period, or have you just been trying to do your best with, you know, paracetamol and rest and stuff like that?
Yeah, rest, and I found that drinking smoothies really helped. I guess that, you know, extra vitamins and things like that did seem to give me a bit of a boost. I've taken lots of vitamins in tablet form as well. I think when you feel so bad, you're willing to just try anything. I did contact the doctor, and he did a whole load of blood tests, and they all came back normal. So, and I had a chest x-ray as well, and that was normal. So although I was feeling really bad, there was nothing that was detected
So your diagnosis of long COVID, Chloe, you've diagnosed yourself. There's not a doctor that said, oh, this is what you've got. This is just, you've concluded this by a process of elimination.
Well, the doctor did, yeah, even though the test came back clear, the doctor did say it's obviously long COVID, but it doesn't always show up in blood tests or X-rays or anything like that. I guess they don't know an awful lot.
Yeah, I'm glad you're feeling better now, Chloe. Does anybody else, if you feel comfortable to say, does anybody else think they are suffering with long COVID? Does anybody else feel like they've got it, or anybody else at home feel like this is an experience that they know of? Katy, I can see you with your hand up. Let's bring in Katy if we can. Try and unmute her. Katy Evans-Bush, for the people on the tech. We're just finding you, Katy. There you go.
Okay.
Hiya.
Hi.
Hi, how are you feeling now?
Well, about the same as I have. I was interested in what Chloe said about feeling better after the second jab. I had COVID really quite badly for several months in early, March 2020. So very early on. Even before the lockdown started, I was ill. And I was really I had relapse after relapse, and it was the last of the relapses that really left me feeling long COVID-y, which is breathless, exhausted, that kind of, it feels like the beginning of pregnancy. It's a kind of chemical exhaustion. Yeah. You're fine until you're not fine, and then you just shut down. I had a chest X-ray, it was clear. I've had blood tests, they were clear. I've had a couple of incidents this summer. I'm now on blood pressure medication. And I had my initial telephone consultation with the long COVID clinic yesterday, which I thought people might find interesting, because what they said to me is that people are overwhelmingly coming to them with these same symptoms, heart palpitations, etc. Breathlessness, fatigue, exhaustion. It's just a weird thing. The word fatigue doesn't really cover it. And anxiety, a lot of anxiety, but obviously that's, you're going to be anxious, aren't you?
Yeah.
But apparently, even when they order sort of specialist blood tests, it's like Chloe was saying, but she said, everybody's blood tests are coming back normal, everyone. It's not showing up in ECGs, mostly. It's not showing up in the blood tests. It's just that people are just left feeling ill for, ages. The best I've felt since March 2020, sadly, was in the period between my first jab and the second one. And I felt so much better after the first jab, after being sick for a week after the jab, and then I got better. I went into the second jab with a very light heart, and then just gradually realized I was beginning to feel really out of breath and headachy and tired.
Katy, thanks so much for coming on, and I'm going to try and come next to James Harding, who is joined from home, and I know this is a topic very close to your heart, and then we're going to come to Gez, because Gez, I know, has also had it and looked into it a ton, and might be able to just help start answering the beginnings anyway of some of our questions. Hiya, James.
Hey, Liz. Actually, I just wanted to say, rather than the personal stuff, Kate, my wife's had long COVID and has written about it, but actually Gez is much better to speak to, because he's got really done a lot of really good investigation and discussion on this. I suppose the thing that I'm hoping to get out of on this conversation for us editorially is what you do about it, because the prompt for this, just to give everyone a sense of it, was we heard late last week that Ed Yong, who's become something of a guru in COVID coverage at The Atlantic, was writing a piece about long COVID. And I had this dream, which was, we'd finally get all the answers and then we'd be able to pore over them together on a Tuesday night. But actually, if you read Ed Yong's piece, what it overwhelmingly says is we don't know. And so I think bringing together what people do know would be really helpful, and how we might think about doing that. We talked to Gez, for example, about a long COVID podcast. Is there a way of doing something that recognises the scale of what people are dealing with, and then tries to provide something that is useful information? Because I think in this case, actually, people who've got long COVID have got a lot of data and information to bring to bear to this.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Jeff. Let's go to Gez then. Hiya, Gez. Thanks so much for being here. Gez, I guess we've heard only a couple of stories, and I know that there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who've experienced it. I can see as well Daniel Dipper, who's a great friend of Tortoise, has himself suffered, and this idea that when people are going for help to medical practitioners, they're not taken seriously. Is that a common thing, or is it just that all the medical practitioners are tied up with people who are dying of non-long COVID, short COVID, if you like, and they just haven't got round to this yet?
So I think there's a couple of things going on there. The first of them is that the medical establishment is very much, they don't like saying, and they are taught when they are in medical school to not admit to saying, I don't know. So if they can't find something in the tests, they tend to sort of float towards these medically unexplained symptoms, which people who've had ME and CFS have had this for a long time, which basically means, well, it's maybe in your head, we can't see it in the test, therefore it's not real. So there's some doctors who fall into that camp of, I can't see it in the tests, I can't deal with you, go away. And then we've got, the long COVID clinics, which have been set up now. And the problem with the long COVID clinics at the moment is they're slightly toothless. So they're doing investigation after investigation from specialist to specialist to specialist. But all of these, again, are kind of generally coming back normal. Some people may have some organ damage here or there, but that's probably not what's actually driving their long COVID. The real sort of the gold dust here, or the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, is what's the mechanism that's causing the illness for most people. And it's made even more complicated by the fact that you've probably got maybe 4 or 5 different phenotypes of long COVID, which people may belong to 1, 2, 3, or all of them. And each of these may have a slightly different mechanism. So it's a really complex, multi-system, multifactorial illness. And the medical establishment is desperately trying to catch up, but research takes time. And it's only now, they've kind of ignored ME/CFS. There has been research on ME/CFS, some of which we can dip back into now and is quite useful. But a lot of it's kind of been ignored for a long time. And now the wheels are starting to grind into motion, but it's going to take some time before we start to get some concrete answers. We do have some sense at the moment about which directions we need to be looking in, but it's going to be a while before your GP looks at you and says, here you go, have this, you'll be better in 2 weeks. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So
just to be clear, Gez, as it stands at the moment, I could go to the doctor and say, I think I've got long COVID and I've got the fatigue and I've got the palpitations and I'm ticking all the boxes. And there is no test that exists at the moment that the doctor can do that says, yep, that's what you've got it.
Essentially correct. Now, there's a couple of places that offer you cytokine panels. So there's a doctor called Bruce Patterson in the States who's making a significant amount of money by doing basically cytokines are inflammatory mediators in the blood, and these can be elevated in long haulers. And he's come up with a long hauler index that you can test positive for. But again, these are really expensive tests. Knowing that you test positive on this scale isn't very helpful. You can't get these tests in the UK. Essentially, the answer is that there isn't really a widely accepted diagnostic test for it.
Okay, and Gez, you said that the research is just starting to sort of grind into motion now. So is it your sense that research into people suffering from long COVID is now, in this country anyway, happening, well-funded? Yes. It's just going to take a bit of time?
Yes, but again, like each of these research sort of projects are sort of looking into one sort of particular niche, and there are huge gaps. There's no sort of coordinated, there should be a big coordinated vision. The NIHR should be that body. You have this coordinated vision of, let's look at all the things that could be causing it and systematically go through it and work out, research this, research this, research this. But it's really piecemeal, and there's a little bit of autoimmunity being researched here. There's some effects on exercise being researched there, but there isn't really a coordinated overview. And that's kind of frustrating from a sufferer's point of view, because there's huge gaps there that need to be filled, or we're going to be waiting even longer.
And do we know any of the sort of start point information? So people presenting with long COVID, do we know demographically what they sort of look like? Very quickly we knew, it seems like COVID is affecting older men, people who are overweight worse. We knew that really quickly. With long COVID, do we have a sense of that at all? Who's getting it worse than other people?
Yeah, so it's about 2/3 women, about 1/3 men. This suggests that it's something related to autoimmunity, because women are more likely to suffer from autoimmune conditions. In terms of the age profile, it can be any age. From literally sort of people have been talking about having 18-month-old children who've been suffering with long COVID symptoms, all the way up to old people. But the bulge is really around middle age, sort of 30 to 50 or so. And these are people who were previously very active and very fit, with a propensity to actually being more active and fit than the average sort of person, in the population. So there does also seem to be a strange correlation there with activity levels and fitness, which we might not have expected.
Thanks, Gez. Sorry, I know I'm looking at my screen. I'm trying to keep up with the chat, but if people in the room want to chime in, so just stick your hand in the air. Is the chin stroking a thought? Giles?
I'm hesitant because it's a bit of a question. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine. James is at home. It's okay.
So when we did the piece last year, or whenever it was, a big question was, because it was pre-vaccines, was would they help? And Chloe says it's helped.
Yeah.
And forgive me,
Katy
said it hasn't really.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's an overall view forming as to whether it helps with long COVID as well as with short.
I think Gez actually put a note in the chat about this. No, it's fine. Gez, you mentioned we do have some stats on whether the vaccine makes you feel better or worse. Was it about 2/3 better? I can't remember.
No, not that much. So I actually, I did one of the first sort of patient-led studies into this, seeing how long haulers reacted to the vaccine on first dose and then subsequently second dose. There's been a larger sort of study done by another patient-led group as well since then. And what it looks like is that long haulers tend to respond better to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, slightly less well to the AstraZeneca vaccine. More people feel better than worse after the first dose, and this is also replicated after the second dose, similar sorts of figures. But the majority of people end up being the same after that initial period of not feeling so well. So you're looking at about 20 to 30% of people feeling better, the majority, about 50%, no change, and then a minority actually getting worse after the vaccine.
Interesting. Let's go to Basia Cummings on screen, just making a comment about the psychology of this. Basia.
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
I just was thinking about it because I've been reading a book which is called The Sleeping Beauties, which is about illnesses that have been documented, have physical symptoms, but then no one is sure of the causality of them or the pathology of them, and they're attributed, or increasingly the science behind it looks like there are complicated neurological things going on and or psychosocial things going on. So it's a combination of social factors and psychological factors that cause physical symptoms. But because of the ways that, I guess, the medical establishment, which is a term I'm using, which I don't really know what it means, but the sort of the canon of thinking in the medical community is that you find what's going on and you treat it. You look at the symptoms, you find out what's gone wrong, and you either prescribe medicine. But with things that are more nebulous, that arise from a neurological problem, it's much harder to diagnose. And I wonder whether, we mentioned it in the meeting earlier about the sort of the nastiness and the controversy around chronic fatigue syndrome and how that's become a really kind of toxic battleground. And how do you attribute a pathology or causality to something where people know that they feel unwell, but there is sort of diagnostic framework to say, yes, this is what's going wrong with you. There's lots of I think different competing ideas about what might be going wrong there. And I think with long COVID, the longer it takes for there to be a clear set of criteria for what might be going wrong in somebody's body that is apart from the obvious kind of link to COVID, why some people are affected and others aren't, I think it opens up the space for much more disagreement about how much the brain plays a role in that. And I recommend reading this book, The Sleeping Beauties, which looks at various different kinds of physical conditions that arise from very complicated neurological and social triggers. Interesting.
Thanks, Basia. Kerry?
Yeah, I've been talking to Gez about maybe doing a long COVID podcast. And Gez mentioned a couple of times on the call the read across from ME, CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, to long COVID. And I hadn't noticed until recently that the ME Society, whatever they are, have kind of really embraced long COVID as part of their kind of mission now. But what was interesting to me is as Gez and I have been talking about potentially doing a podcast, I've been putting the word about amongst researchers and scientists to say, we're thinking of doing this, who would be good to talk to? Maybe there's someone who could present this thing with Gez or whatever. And then a couple of weeks later, out of the blue, somebody called me back, someone I hadn't talked to, and just said, be careful here, this thing is a hornet's nest. You know what the MECFS thing is like? It's really brutal, and this thing is heading in the same direction. Be very careful. And it's interesting, when in a previous life I covered MECFS, I've never had more hate mail. I had death threats. It became a really brutal kind of battle between people who felt that they weren't being taken seriously, that their condition wasn't being taken seriously by the medical profession, and fought very, very hard against any idea that there might be a psychological component to it. And on the other hand, doctors who were prescribing talking therapy or, graduated exercise, those kind of things. And so I think on the one hand, you've got the sort of MECFS campaigners of old who see perhaps long COVID as, perhaps the allies they've been kind of looking for in their fight for, ever and ever. And on the other hand, I think we are beginning to see a problem, which is that same argument, which is this resistance to any idea that there could be a psychological component is beginning to come to the fore in ways that certainly in MECFS frightened off researchers, I know, because they became quite nasty.
It's very telling about how I use the word generally, discern a difference between what is a mental illness and what is a physical illness, because if there's a suggestion there's a psychological component, that would inherently diminish the seriousness of the condition itself is the thing.
And in something like this, just listen to Chloe, to Gez's experiences, to Katy, of course there's going to be a psychological effect.
Yeah.
It's bound, how could it not be? But it's how that then translates into a sort of binary choice between causes, which I think is not what what's intended.
Go for it, Tessa.
Sorry. Thanks. It just strikes me that there's this there's this third element, which is we never seem to, in this country, look at endocrinology, if that's the right word.
I don't know what endocrinology is.
Well, it's basically the study of hormones.
Okay.
And this massive rise in inflammatory diseases that, we know there's this big increase in autoimmune diseases. There's something sort of going on there that's quite systemic, I think, and it takes me back to our Good Shit series, which was brilliant, about the gut basically being the second brain. And that's where I run out of any big words in relation to this subject. But I wonder if this whole area of inflammation, the hormone system, is just something we never have really looked at. Or, I speak to friends who are in France, they see they go and see an endocrinologist, oh God, help me out, was it endocrinologist or whatever? Hormone doctor, thanks, Gary. As a standard, particularly women, after having children. Anyway, it was just a thought, and I defer to any medical experts on the call about that sort of area.
Thanks, Tessa. There's tons of people I want to make sure I bring in. I definitely want to hear from Nabia, who has got a point about where you get your information from. You know, if the doctor has said, I can't find anything wrong with you, then where do you go, and how reliable is that? So we'll come to you in a second, Nabia, but and Susannah, Lloyd, I'd love to hear from as well, from Doctors in Distress. Charlotte, who, I don't know your surname, Charlotte, but you've been making a lot of comments. I want to hear from you as well. Gez, just before we leave hormones behind, what do we know about this point that Tessa was making about the sort of, is there a special hormone focus in the research about long COVID, or not really?
I'm not aware of any studies at the moment looking into that, but it seems to be very sort of widely accepted that women have a shocker, basically, when it comes to time of the month and their long COVID symptoms. And that is almost universal amongst women who have experienced long COVID. So the hormones definitely play a role in this, but exactly what that role is, we don't quite understand yet.
Okay, thanks, Gez. Nabia, let's go to you now. Nabia's joining us from the John Schofield Trust and works, I think, is it HuffPo you work for, Nabia?
Yeah, HuffPost UK, yeah.
So what do you think about long COVID? You've not got it.
No, I've not got it. I've not had any experience of it. And I just want to apologise if my connection is a bit funny at all tonight.
Don't worry.
But what I notice a lot with some of the work that I do, which is predominantly looking at trends on Instagram, TikTok and social media, is that the level of misinformation out there for people that have either had COVID or long COVID is so high that I think, to Jez's points about the limits in terms of research and how long it might take before there is scientific evidence, I think that can be particularly harmful for seeing to help. That's kind of a big danger to anyone who's accessing that information more widely across social. So yeah, I think the misinformation thing is something that probably needs to be looked in a bit more, especially when it comes to social platforms.
Have you looked up and found out things that you know to be nonsense about long COVID?
Well, I know that there was quite a viral video very recently. It was more to do with the vaccine and what the long-term effects of having can do. And there's also at the moment I've had things living with different body.
We're losing you a little bit. Your connection's just breaking up a little bit. I'm going to go to Susannah. We might come back and try you again in a second. Can we go to Susannah Lloyd, who is with Doctors in Distress? And I know we've had Doctors in Distress people on Thinkings before. Hi, Susannah.
Hi, Liz. Thank you.
What are you thinking about all this?
So just as a bit of context, Doctors in Distress provide support groups for medical professionals, so doctors, nurses, allied health professionals. And since October 2020, we've been providing support groups which are facilitated by accredited group analysts or counsellors to give people a space to talk about long COVID. We don't talk about symptoms, we don't talk about diagnostics, but we just give people a space to talk about how they're feeling. And I think a few people have touched on this, that there's a huge sense of isolation when you have long COVID, particularly for doctors and nurses who've got it from work, but for everyone. So to have that space, we found, has been really powerful to share, to feel validated. A lot of people have come to our groups, healthcare professionals themselves, and have been told that their illness isn't real. So we're really seeing psychologically a positive impact from our groups of just coming together and speaking. But I know a few people have mentioned on the chat that the groups haven't been very helpful because it's sometimes been a bit negative. I think if there are, and I don't know if they do exist, but our groups are facilitated, as I said, by counsellors, and that really helps to kind of keep the conversation positive and supportive.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. And it's nice to hear from you. Could we go to Charlotte now? Charlotte with no surname, if you're still here, who's been very active.
I added my surname.
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Sorry, I was just a bit naughty. Forgot to do it.
That's okay. So Charlotte, are you a sufferer? Are you a long hauler?
So basically, I don't know what I've got. I got ill in January and I never was diagnosed with COVID, but I've had something since then. And I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome in July. Oh, wow. And actually, I've been quite lucky because I was really believed by my GPs and I got quite a quick referral. And I wondered whether that's partly because of long COVID, because you hear such terrible stories historically for people with these kinds of conditions. And I think maybe long COVID has led to more recognition of post-viral issues. But I think what I was trying to say is that I think the sort of uncertainty about the underlying causes, and the fact that the model used in the UK for a really long time has been that it is of psychological origin, has led to a lack of research into other possible explanations, which means that essentially nothing's happened, which means now long COVID's come along, there aren't answers. And I'm sort of hoping that might change, but I don't know how anybody's aware, but NICE were due to publish guidelines on the 18th of August to change the treatment for people with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome.
Right.
And basically a group of doctors said they would refuse to follow the new guidelines, which have been 3 years in the making, and NICE have been forced to delay that. And so there are treatments that in places like America are discredited that are still essentially going to happen in the UK, because although NICE was totally evidence-based, they've just, they've sort of refused to play ball. And obviously that's quite distressing. And I suppose my worry for long COVID is that I think there's a lot of ingrained attitudes in general about what causes these kinds of things, medically unexplained symptoms. And I think it's holding up the potential for actually people to find out what's going on.
Charlotte, do you know, when you say that the NICE guidelines were going to change from something to something else 3 weeks ago, and then doctors said no, what do you have a sense? I don't know if it's possible even for you to know what they were going to change to.
Yeah, so they were going to remove graded exercise therapy, which they basically have said is potentially harmful, and there's no clear evidence that it has benefit. And they were going to say that CBT has historically been used as a curative thing, and the NICE guidelines were going to change. Sorry, there's an ice cream van. Very noisy. It'll stop in a minute.
Oh my God, it's
right.
well,
Sorry, but yeah, they were so. And then the CBT has historically been told to be curative for people with ME/CFS because obviously the idea is it is psychological, and there was a change to say it can support people who, you know, in the experience of having a chronic illness, but is no longer defined as curative. I mean, this is much more aligned to what's been happening in America, where they essentially redefined all of this in about 2015. But yeah, essentially several of the doctors' bodies, I can't remember which ones, said they wouldn't support it. I mean, this has been 3 years in the making. All of the evidence has been gone through consultation process, everything. It was literally at the final hour that it got pulled.
Gosh, yes, Katy, this Katy here. Oh, I can't see Kira, she's too far away. Let's go for Katy and then we'll come to Kira. Sorry, Kira, you're directly behind Giles. I can't tell you're there.
Sorry, Kira. Okay. Just picking up on the point that was just made actually about medically unexplained. You know, my point to Tess's point would be, is it actually just medically unexplored?
Yeah.
So the fact that this is 2/3 affecting women, the question about hormones, Gez's point about inflammation, things in the blood, I would ask the question as to whether we're looking in the right places, and if hormones and time of the month and periods are the point where long haulers feel the most strain on their bodies, then that's telling us something. And Gez, who seems to have explored this quite a lot, the fact that you don't know, Gez, if they're looking at hormones or not, worries me a bit, because it feels like all the evidence, or all the sort of data, all the stories are there to maybe look at the data differently. That would be my point.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
Yeah, so my point's actually quite similar. It's going back to the hormones and the endocrinology. And I think, again, I defer to any doctors on the call that know more than me, but I think it's so interesting that when we did ask, one of the things was that we think there is, or we know that there's a link there, but we don't really know what it is. And that's kind of the thing, is that we don't know. But what we do know is that women who get the vaccine, it affects their menstrual cycles. We don't know why. Women with long COVID, it affects them so much. We don't know why. We know that our hormonal cycles are these 28 days, like long thing involving so many different hormones that affect our mood, it affects our fatigue, it affects our concentration, it affects so much of us, but it's just kind of like, oh yeah, that's a women's thing or whatever. It's treated very dismissively. So when we know that our endocrine system affects our daily lives so much, but there's no focus put on it at all. I think it goes back to what Katie says. Are we looking in the right place? And why aren't we looking at this when it affects our daily lives?
Yeah, I totally agree. And we were talking, weren't we, recently, and I'd love to know what people think at home, or maybe Nabia even, about how we can usefully add to the work that's been done on medical sexism. You know, the case has been proven, and we had a great thinking, actually, was it about a year ago now? It probably is a bit longer ago than that, where we looked at it specifically in relation to COVID, and what can we do usefully journalistically to pick at that more. When you go beyond stating the problem, then what? Kind of that's where we keep getting a little bit stuck, I think, on that medical sexism point. I just want to see if they're there, if we can bring in, now hold on, it's two people together, somebody and somebody J, who've been making some comments, and it seems like you've got experiences. Emma and Tom J, are you there and able to come and contribute? Because you've joined in a couple of times, and I'm just interested to know how you would come at this. If you're there, Emma and Tom J.
It's Emma.
Hello.
Can you hear me? But I can't, I've got a very weak connection.
Oh, don't worry. We can hear you. We can hear you well. What are your thoughts, Emma? You seem quite close to this.
No, I just listened to it a lot over the last few months, that was all, and tried to take a perspective on what's happening. And I just think that, I don't what I've made various points. Which one particularly are you asking about?
Any. I'm agnostic as to which one you wanted to bring to the discussion.
Okay, well, there are two things I want to say. One is I don't think that we look long-term at the effects of post-viral diseases. And I think it would be very useful to have a look at that. I think there are plenty of people who have suffered from illnesses and viruses who might have something contribute to the debate that not necessarily have had long COVID. And secondly, I think it's very important that, and that was the last point I made, that about recording our symptoms, because I think as women, but also as very busy people in our lives, we don't do it. And often we have 10 minutes with a doctor when we have to go in and present our case, etc. And we don't have that necessarily all that evidence in hand. And I feel like I've tried to really record various symptoms daily, just keeping a little idea of it, helping those around me. I do quite a lot of voluntary work, getting them to write things down and record it so that when we go and see a medical professional, we can say, but hey, look at this. This is what's happening. Yeah, I don't know, as I think it was Gez was referring to before, doesn't match with the data you're being given. Those were just my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Emma. And I watched one of Gez's videos, actually, where a doctor, a young doctor, she's 35, who had an absolute nightmare with her long COVID. She'd been really, really poorly, and she was sort of recounting her experience of being seen by another doctor. I think she was in hospital, actually. I think she was that poorly. And she said, and I could hear him talking to my brother, who was the person that had gone with her, and saying that I was anxious. He was diagnosing me with anxiety, because if the three sort of key tells of long COVID when it's really bad are breathlessness, palpitations, and feeling anxious, then that all goes with, if you are just, in inverted commas, anxious, you can see how it can quite quickly be sort of comfortably diagnosed in a different way, which I think is interesting. Lara, I know I'm asking you to do 1,000 things at once here, because I know you're trying to moderate the chat and you're doing a heroic job. But clearly you've got a lot to say on this, Lara. So just help us unpick this a little bit, data-wise, story-wise. How do we get a proper go at this, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. My experience of this was that I had COVID in December, and then I had another sort of mystery infection, and they never worked out what it was in January, and I spent 8 nights in hospital. And then I had sort of 3 months where I was having incessant scans and tests, and my bloods were, very wacky, and there was clearly something wrong. And then finally, kind of 2 weeks ago, I started feeling better without treatment, sort of miraculously. And my doctor diagnosed me with this kind of rare autoimmune disease called Kikuchi's, which is self-limiting. So it means hopefully it won't come back. But he said that, and he's at the infectious diseases department in Royal Free, that they're doing a lot of research at the moment, and they're seeing so many young people, quite often young women, coming in with quite kind of sort of what appears to be autoimmune related conditions and symptoms that they just haven't really been able to pin down or diagnose. And because these are kind of rare and manifest in very different ways, the kind of research interest and capacity in them just isn't really there. So obviously I spent kind of many long days in bed just Googling incessantly all of these things, and I'm really none the wiser. So I'm not really sure necessarily how I would even go about doing this. And I mean, my sympathy for people that have had this for far longer and far worse than me is just unbounded, because I can't imagine. I saw the Doctors Distress talking about how anxiety and depression is closely linked to this. I don't know how you can suffer with something like this and not feel those things often, because you're in a way that with many other illnesses you often aren't. You're also asked to face this just like perennial uncertainty about whether you're going to get better, when you're going to get better. And that's really difficult, and something that I think the medical community hasn't necessarily addressed. And I think that is at the root of what we've been talking about in the chat quite a lot, which is the kind of antipathy that meets many of these journalists or professionals who are trying to kind of deal with patient groups, especially around these issues, is that of course you're going to come up against a certain level of frustration and resistance when these are people who have been suffering with these illnesses and haven't been listened to for decades. So it is a very difficult kind of fraught medical landscape as far as I'm aware, and I'm not really sure. It seems like something that was in the Young piece, which was interesting. It's just that kind of a plea for a big listening exercise and a real kind of representation of patient voices in this, which is something which the ME CFS community have been asking for a long time, but I don't have any answers, and I think it's really bleak.
Thanks, Lara. I hope it isn't unremittingly bleak, but I know what you mean. Robert Campbell, you've had your little yellow hand up for a while. I can see you just making a comment about the Zoe app. We had Professor Tim Spector, who's behind the Zoe app, on a think-in a while ago. Hi, Robert.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. Nice to join in again and see you all back after that bit of a break. I was just thinking about the Zoe app, which I've been contributing to since the very start of its implementation. And some of the feedback that I've got from that enabled me to diagnose the fact that I had COVID about 18 months ago, at the very beginning of the pandemic. It just didn't manifest itself in the normal ways. It was one of those skin rashes that at first I thought was shingles. To cut a long story short, I believe it to have been COVID. Luckily, I'm not suffering from any long COVID symptoms, but one of the key things I think has been in contributing to the Zoe app, the understanding on how prevalent veganism has helped. I'm a vegan. How other simple lifestyle choices have been affecting the way I feel or the way things have happened. There's over 4 million contributors to the Zoe app. And I think picking up on something somebody else said earlier on about keeping a diary of symptoms that you can go and talk to the GP with accurately and say, this is what I've been feeling precisely on these days and these things, and being able to relate that to other aspects of one's life, the periodicity of your hormones, particularly in the women's case. Those things can, if we've got 4 million contributors, very quickly one would see that as being a data set that could be used properly. And if we follow Caroline Corrado Perez's view about making sure that we gather sex disaggregated data, harking back to a previous thinking, as you suggested about a year ago on that, sexism within data. And from a journalistic point of view, pointing this stuff out to the researchers and the testing and saying, you've got to put up with the difficulties of making those trials sex disaggregated. You can't just stick to the blokes because the women's scenario is very much more difficult to deal with. You've got to do it. And here's the evidence. Here's some crowdsourced evidence that we can produce, which says there are differences and these are real life experiences. I'm a great fan of crowdsourcing that data, and the Zoe app particularly has done quite a lot, I think, even over the last 18 months it's been around.
Thanks ever so much, Robert. I couldn't agree more on the sex disaggregated data point. James, I know you wanted to come back in. James Harding. Oh, hello.
Live from live. So I tell you what I did want to say. I don't care whether you want to. Do you want to weigh in?
Go first.
Okay. I tell you, Liz, a couple of things. One is, I think there's a kind of overall point here, which is, if you strip out Sarah Gilbert, if you strip out vaccines, just think what we would honestly think of the medical profession so far in their handling of COVID, not just long COVID, but COVID altogether. Just how little is known, the level of uncertainty in the treatment. To be honest with you, the over-promising on the treatments, how much we've heard about Omicron and other these things that haven't yet come to pass. There's very little understanding of the illness. And I think there's an issue here, which is, it was exactly to Jez's point right at the start, which is there's a tendency for the medical profession to be quite uncomfortable about admitting what it doesn't know. And I think that there's an interesting question for us journalistically that arises from that, which is you can't really do medical journalism without medics because we're not trained. Yet at the same time, when you hand over all the coverage of medicine to medics, of course, you're worried about that kind of groupthink or the culture of medicine. And so I think there's an interesting issue for us here. If you think about the things that we've done where we've really committed, accelerating net zero, let's have an index and a weekly newsletter and, series of podcasts, let's make our planet one of them. Is there a version of tortoise journalism around health, right? That is organized listening, that brings in a group of competing points of view, and that we actually try to make that something, because it feels as though this is not going to get resolved in the next few weeks, and I fear possibly even months. And is there something for us to actually take from this and say, okay, well, how are we going to do it? So I know Kerry's talking to Gez about a series of podcasts or a regular podcast. How might we do that? And not just around long COVID. So it's a sort of question back to the newsroom, one for us, I suppose, to pick up in the 10:30 tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Kerry? Oh, Kate. Go for it, Kate.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. I've been kind of turning over my mind a little bit, the idea of support around this. And obviously there are these incredible sort of big networks and, that have been mentioned. But personally, what I find most useful is when I'm buddied up with someone who has long COVID and there is a kind of seesaw effect, which is when they're having a bad day, they can kind of mentally get support from you and vice versa. I wondered whether that was a little bit similar to Alcoholics Anonymous or NA or those kind of support networks where actually often people who are perhaps slightly further down the road than you or have seen some improvement or have got some wisdom that they've learned along the way can actually pass back some of that the sort of learning that they've had along the way and how you can apply it to yourself, or you can pull each other up by your bootstraps. Because I don't know whether the support groups, or if anyone knows this, has done any work in terms of splintering down and pairing people up, but I personally think that that's really the thing that's got me through the last 9 to 10 months is two friends who've got long COVID badly, and we have really helped each other. And that when you're in a hole, and it's such a mercurial and cruel illness, as everyone knows, that you keep getting gaslit by it. You keep needing to be told that bad day is not going to last forever, and when you're down in the ditch, it's going to get better. And so it's just a thought I had, and I wondered whether anyone had come across anything like that, that kind of support.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, and there was a couple of comments in the chat early on about people who've experimented with support groups and found them sort of more or less helpful, because, as you say, Kate, in a relationship where you've got somebody who you're close to and it's just the two of you, you can apply a sort of greater degree of sensitivity to the other person's reality that day than, I suppose, launching yourself into a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group or something like that when it's a less well moderated. But there must be data and learnings in aggregate inside of those spaces that would be massively useful. If you could somehow crystallise the patterns, then there must be ways that is possible. I don't know how quite. Kerry, I was going to come to you on how we turn this into something journalistically.
I completely agree with James. I think there's a critique of journalism, which is that journalistic organisations have tended in the past to be very good at dealing with authority. Who do I pick up the phone to? If I'm trying to write this piece, I'm trying to organise this radio programme, who do I pick up the phone to? So journalistic news organisations have been good at dealing with authority and bad at dealing with crowdsourced things. And one of the features of this, and one of the great things in talking to people like Gez, is that so much of this has been patient-led, and that is going to be a challenge to traditional journalism because it doesn't answer that "who do I pick up the phone to" question. I think we can answer that because the way that when we're talking about doing this podcast, so we're talking about doing a weekly long COVID podcast for as long as there's an audience for it. That shouldn't be a broadcast. That should be a rallying point for patient focus for the community that undoubtedly sort of has coalesced around long COVID and its treatment and that sort of shared sense of, we've got to do this for ourselves because the medical profession is not showing that much enthusiasm for doing it on our behalf.
Yeah, for sure. Gez, if you're still there, talking about Gez, though he's not, but he is very much very much there. I was going to ask you, I was listening to, and I was listening, I know it's on YouTube, I was listening with my headphones today, to an episode on your YouTube channel where you were talking to a guy and he was talking about, well, I don't know if this is the right thing to call it, an alternative therapy, I would call it, called craniosacral therapy, that he said categorically, it works in relation to long COVID. And because I was working at the same time, I sort of missed sort of every third thing that was being sort of landed. But I suppose if we're talking about learnings from patient support groups and crowdsourcing, unofficial, non-robust kind of data, I do have a sort of slight ick about hearing people say, I can tell you categorically this, what I would consider an alternative therapy works in this scenario. How do we stay responsible whilst embracing this brave new world of crowdsourced medical journalism?
Well, it's difficult. So one of the things that anybody who's had long COVID will have experienced is this thing of someone saying, you know what you need to do? You need to take zinc. You know what you need to do? You need to take vitamin B12. You need to take like goat, leg of frog and thing of goat. But a lot of this stuff was floating around. We didn't really have any sense for whether any of it worked. So I did a sort of a patient-led study where I looked at over 1,000 people, what they were taking, and then did a statistical breakdown on sort of a linear sort of progression of symptoms and looked at what they were doing. And what we found that supplements, by and large, by themselves, as a general term, made no difference to people. People who were on supplements weren't doing any better after they started taking them than the people who hadn't. But one thing that was starting to help, and that was statistically significant, was taking the flushing variety of niacin. And there is some science behind why this might be. So I guess in terms of answering your question, there are ways that we can sort of try to, find out stuff quickly. And this is the sort of, I call it quick and dirty sort of patient-led research. This isn't going to get published in the Lancet, but it does give us a sense for, frankly, what is bollocks and what isn't. And if you do it in a focused way, based on things which have some science behind them, with dysautonomia, for example, is a incredibly frequent problem with long COVID. And that essentially is related to overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight and flight, and underactivation of the parasympathetic, which is the rest, digest, heal. And one of the ways that you can sort of reset this is through sort of manipulating the vagus nerve, which helps control all of this. And craniosacral therapy, for one, might just do that. There's reason to believe that it would do that. So I guess in terms of how do we do this? I think we need to sort of look at the science and then try and gather what evidence we can in a way that doesn't take 3 years in the same way that an RCT would do if you're going to try and roll it out and make it for the NHS.
Do you think that that is the right goal to have for a long COVID sort of regular piece of reporting, audio reporting, that we're going to try and find out answers? Is that the right goal to have in terms of therapies?
I think the goal is to help people. There's different ways of helping people.
Yeah.
And again, there's 100 different ways of trying to help people, but ultimately we want to get better, and people aren't seeming to get better that often by themselves. So it does seem that most people who got COVID and then long COVID from the first wave, so approaching 18 months, the majority of them are still unwell, and I'm one of them, and we seem to be the majority. So something needs to change here for us to get better. Is it just a time thing, or is there something else we need to do? And I think it's a mighty quest for us to try and find out what's going on and how do we fix it.
Yeah, it certainly is a mighty quest. He doesn't know I'm going to do this, but Giles, bearing in mind you did the first thing that we did sometime between 6 months and a year ago, none of us can remember. What do you take from the conversation we've had over the last hour or so?
I'm really struck that nobody's mentioned the words cytokine and storm in the same breath, because we spoke to a couple of kind of acute sufferers who I think were both medics, or at least one of them was, in the States, and were very keen to find concrete explanations for what they were going through, were broadly impressed with what their insurers allowed them to do by way of looking for explanations. And as I recall, both were satisfied that this was an overreaction of the immune system. Yeah. And there was also a theory that little pockets of virus had been left behind. I forget if it was in the bile or somewhere else, but we've heard nothing concrete like that. It seems as if we've moved away from any certainty about anything. Is the cytokine storm theory dead?
Well, I don't know. I had the same question about the theory that it's caused by a reactivation of the Epstein-Barr virus that lives inside of most of people, which is the thing that causes glandular fever, that the having of COVID activates that, because it's a similar sort of experience. I have the same question. I had read a thing which almost said, well, now we found out what it is, job done. And of course, that isn't the case at all.
Sorry, that's just kind of interesting. Thanks, Tricia. My elder daughter had COVID and has had, last year had sort of long COVID symptoms, including sort of liver inflammation and all sorts of malarkey going on. But interestingly, she tested for glandular fever.
So she had positive for Epstein-Barr, but not
positive for COVID, but also had antibodies showing that she'd had glandular fever, which I don't think at any point we thought she'd had.
Yeah.
But it is, that link. But to your point, I mean, that sort of was there last summer and then just disappeared again, didn't it?
Does anybody know somebody who has had long COVID who is completely better now? Does anybody know anybody who feels like they've come through it and out the other side and is completely better? Basia does. And Daniel Dipper. Oh, Daniel Dipper. Let's go to Daniel. If you can find Daniel.
Hello, hopefully.
Hello.
Hello,
hopefully you're better.
Oh, hello. Yeah, so I'm just in my Oxford room at the moment, literally just taking a bit of a time off because I'm helping to run an access program. But yeah, I had COVID. I caught it at the start of November 2020. I was quite ill with it. The start of January, I had to take about 2 weeks off. I was just sleeping all the time, was knocked out. I managed to make it through just about to the end of my spring term, and then had to take another 2 weeks off because I was just flattened. End of April, smell and taste was weird. Like every 2 weeks, things would just smell and taste different. And it was just a constant cycle of trying to find different foods because things I could eat last week, I couldn't eat this week. And there was kind of like a safe list and a not so safe list, and stuff would keep moving backwards and forwards. And I mean, now my taste is normal, but there are still some things I used to be able to eat I can't eat, and some things I couldn't eat before, which I can eat. So it's very weird. But yeah, around May this year, I kind of just was suddenly better. And I was just able to kind of do a full 7-day week. I kind of started going back to doing kind of all the different extracurricular things I've been doing. And yeah, taste came back normally. I'd say that actually, particularly after my first vaccine, I'd say my smell has actually come back really strongly. My smell, I actually think, was one of my weakest senses. And now I'd say it's quite strong. I can pick up stuff before most people can pick it up now, which is really weird because I kind of feel like my smell's been like supercharged. But yeah, I was recovered before the vaccines, but now I had both of the vaccines and I feel even better after them.
I'm really pleased. And wouldn't it be brilliant if everybody who currently has long COVID ends up some kind of superhero? I think that is a real outcome. Thank you so much. I'm just noticing Ed, our colleague Ed Davison, has just put a post in the chat. Ed, we've just got about a minute or so left. Do you want to just tell us your story? I had no idea this happened to you. I'm so sorry. That's awful.
Thanks, Des. Yeah, it was a shame. So I was sort of out of action for about 6 months at university, nearly dropped out, and I was stuck in a sort of ME syndrome, which is sort of feels along the lines of what people have been discussing tonight. And doctor couldn't help. No one really knew what to do. There wasn't any mainstream understanding. And in the end, sort of through word of mouth, went on a course which was called the Lightning Process, which my friends all took the piss out of me for going on. But it cured me instantly within about a week of doing. It was to do with mental processes and all the rest of it. But when you have ME, it feels very physical, your illness. And I'm sure there's big differences between ME and long COVID, but it feels very physical in it. But there is a psychological element as well, like intrinsically bound up in it, which was proven true for me in the case that when I went on a course which trained me to think in a certain way, that I was miraculously better. But it was always it's still a sort of mystery to how that worked, why it worked, yeah, interesting to hear that in light of the discussion of long COVID now.
Totally fascinating. Thanks, Ed. Well, we've got a long to-do list after this evening. I want to say a really sincere thank you to everybody who's joined in. We've covered, I think, a lot of ground, and I feel like we've pulled at quite a few threads on this long COVID question. There's too many people who've come on screen to speak for me to list everybody. I've made a number of notes. I'm sure Kerry has too. And I know that I can see Patricia and Kira as well making notes, particularly about the research and sex disaggregated data point. This thing about post-viral diseases and post-infection syndrome seems like it's an underexplored, to your point, Katy, element of it, this idea about recording symptoms and recording them in a very granular way and somehow finding a way to sort of quickly aggregate data that may exist already in the world. Anyway, we will come back to this in our daily internal editorial meeting, which happens at 10:30 tomorrow, to see if we can find a way to sort of scope this new way of reporting health and particularly long COVID. Thank you so much to Gez, of course, to Chloe for getting things going, and to Nabia, who joined in gamely from the John Schofield Trust, our valued partner as part of the Tortoise Community Network. Thank you very much to you all. Have a nice rest of the evening, and we will see you again tomorrow evening. Thank you so much. Bye.